Good morning and welcome to another broadcast from the ACT Chess Association of their online events, which are being held here in Canberra, Australia, while our regular chess clubs aren't meeting due to COVID-19 social distancing restrictions. The ACT Chess Association organises these events. My name is Sean Press. I do it on behalf of the Chess Association, and we normally run 3 events a week: a Monday Blitz, a Wednesday Rapid, and a Thursday long time control event. So last night, being Monday night, we had our Blitz event. These events, as I've pointed out in previous streams, normally attract a strong field but a small field, and once again we had 8 players taking part, which meant it was a 4-round tournament. Chess.com don't do round robins, by the way, otherwise I've thrown in some extra rounds in there, but nonetheless it was once again a good field, and due to the short number of rounds, hardly surprisingly, it ended in a big tie for first in this case. I think we had, if I can check my standings, just excuse me, where have I got them? I've got them here. Jeremy Reading, Malik Amir, and Matt Radicic all tied on 3 out of 4, with Michael Reading on 2.5 in 4th place. So it was quite a hard-fought event. These days, the event's also attracting a couple of 1800 rated players or slightly less players from Sydney. And it's one of those players' games that I am going to feature. Unfortunately, in their case, it wasn't a win for them. It was a win for Matt Radicic, who is a regular player featured on this stream, mainly because of his interesting and inventive opening play. So I'll just switch across to that game. And so Matt Rad is white. Anthony Durack, playing under the name of Beat 43210, is black. So Matt played e4, and after e5, d4, which is the centre game. And Matt's a bit of a specialist in this these days. And I do recommend you take it head on with e takes d4, queen takes, knight c6, queen e3. It's worth booking up if you know you're going to be playing someone like Matt. However, you don't have to do a massive amount of theory on this one. The main line is pretty direct all the way through. I think there's only a couple of variations going in either direction. So black is generally on pretty safe ground if they make the effort to look up this opening. d6 is a system. I don't like it, to be honest, because the early exchange, but some people have played it as black. And the idea is queens come off, and you have a relatively peaceful position. But I'll talk about positions where queens come off in a second. So d takes e5 is obvious, d takes e5, swap queens, so black can't castle anymore. And I've had this position a few times as white, and a play often revolves around hitting the e pawn and hitting the f pawn. But even though you think that white has a clear advantage here simply because they can castle, it turns out that both these targets are sometimes quite difficult to attack. And the other interesting thing about this position, I'll get to it in a second, is that, well, I'll wait a little bit further. We'll go bishop c4 first, hitting f7. f5 was a nice aggressive move, and I didn't mind it, but I'm just a little bit surprised, essentially. If you're going to play d6 and not take on d4, which is kind of the passive choice, then playing something like f5 does surprise me a little bit. And white went with knight c3. The other line, knight f3, the whole idea, of course, of hitting the e-pawn. And, of course, if something like f takes happens, knight takes e5 just wins on the spot because you're just going into f7 here and you're going to win the rook in the corner. So that's a reason for playing knight f3 rather than knight to c3. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Knight c6 instead to defend. And you can follow up with knight c3. Or you could try for e takes f5. Bishop takes f5 with the idea of knight here, knight to g5, again looking at f7. But knight d4 is a nice reply, because essentially you're both taking turns at forking king and rook, and eventually position generally is equal. But knight c3 was played instead, knight c6, and white's actually using the fact that the black king is in the center to accelerate development, bringing pieces out with check. Okay, knight f6, castles with check, bishop d6. So about now is probably another point I'm going to make. In a position like this, when queens were on the board, if you had a position like this and you both still, white and black, had queens, with the king trapped in the center or stuck in the center, not able to castle, white has already castled and is getting lead development, you'd be looking for checkmate. You'd be trying to open the center, and you'd be aiming for checkmate. With queens off the board, that's a lot harder to do, and instead, normally what the player with a lead in development in a position like this tries to instead is win material, and as much as just winning a single pawn. You use your lead in development to make threats against your opponent's pawn center, or you look for some little tactical tricks. So, for example, white went knight b5, and the idea is to take on d6, and then just win the pawn that way. But black had a nice counter with knight d4. Not a perfect counter because there's a very strong reply for white in this position. But for example, after knight b5, for example, you took here instead, then you would get knight takes, c takes, rook takes d6, king to e7, rook drops back to e2, bishop e6. The engine thinks that this position is pretty equal. I tend to favour white here for a human reason, which is I think these two pawns on e5 and e4 are going to be a weakness. Having said that, f2 sometimes causes problems for white simply because of the open f file there. So you could go down this line, but instead knight d4 was played, and knight takes d4 was a response. It turns out that f4 was actually a much stronger move in this position. I'm not going to criticize white for missing it. It's a bit of a surprise, but it takes advantage of all the tactics based on pinned pieces. You've got the rook on the same file as the king, so both the bishop on d6 and the knight on d4 are running into trouble. You've got the knight on f6 pinned, and you're hitting in the center. And throw, for example, let's start with the obvious knight takes b5. F takes e5 is actually the best reply here because both those pieces are pinned and can't move. So it's not just a pawn fork, it's also attacking pinned pieces. And for example, the knight's still hanging. And so bishop takes knight is being threatened. So if you play something like a6 to do that, because that's about the only square the knight actually has no squares to go to. And if you play a6 with the idea of a7, e takes f6 just wins on the spot. Because essentially g takes f6, bishop takes f6 just wins the rook in the corner. And you're also threatening a discovered move like this, just taking down here as well. Black is in serious trouble in that line. So we don't take on b5. If we take on f4, sorry, with the e-pawn, then e5 just causes the same sort of havoc here. Bishop takes e5, and then knight f3 is the right move because you're hitting the bishop, which has got nowhere to go. You're hitting the knight, which is pinned as well, and you're eventually going to win all these pieces. So that's the problem there. And at the end of the day, white's going to be a piece up. F takes e4, same problem. F takes e5, bishop takes e5, knight takes d4. In this case, not quite as, actually no, is as catastrophic simply because I'm just counting the pieces and white's a piece up. Knight c6 seems to be about the only move, but even then you're in trouble. Knight to f3, f takes e4, f takes e5. Okay, we take the knight, but then we run into the same problem as earlier. E takes f6. You're threatening pawn takes g7 and attacking the king at the same time, winning the rook in the corner. If you take on f6 like this, you win the rook in the corner with the bishop fork. So f4 was a very strong move, but knight takes d4 wasn't bad. White's still better in this position. E takes, and then rook takes. We could try e5 here. Bishop takes, again, knight f3 with the idea of attacking the e5 bishop and the d4 pawn. After we retreat, knight takes d4. White's not bad in this position as well. But rook takes d4, and we've kind of got what I said slightly earlier. When you've got the lead in development, your opponent's king's trapped in the center. With queens on, you're looking for mate. With queens off, you're just looking for winning material. In this case, white's picked up a pawn and still has the pin on f6 and has a better position. Black really needed to try rook e8 here, and after knight e2, rook takes e4 to win back the pawn. Bishop d3 is a nice move because after rook takes, knight takes, you're ganging up on the f pawn there. You can't play g6, of course, because you drop the knight. And after c6, we just take here. And white's up a pawn and has a good position. the line that had been recommended instead after bishop d3 was to play rook here, rook and rook. But white is still a lot better in this position, mainly because for now the rook on a8 is out of play, while the rook on h1 can join in. And I'll highlight that again a little bit further down the track, I think. So king e7 was played. This wasn't great. And white now is just playing knight f3 with the idea of e5. So f takes, rook takes check, king f8. Now the knight rook here is under attack. And white played the sensible-ish move of taking on f6 to avoid that. The other tries just to keep the pressure with rook e1. And after bishop g4, you'd play knight e5. And this is the other point I'm going to highlight in this position. White is better. Now, a piece of advice from Bill Hartston, which was strong players just don't go, oh, I must be better in this position, or, you know, I'm better because my pieces are on better squares. Essentially, what they often also do is they compare the different pieces, and they say, which of my pieces are better than my opponent's pieces? And to cut this story short, the white rooks are better than the black rooks here, simply because the rook, especially the one on h8, is tucked in behind, is still stuck in the corner and can't use the kings in the rook. And having a king back rank between two rooks is not ideal, because it does cut the coordination between the rooks. Bishop f6 instead to keep the rook on e4. And I suppose the question was, did the rook need to stay on e4? Or was that bishop better than its counterpart? Because now it's come off. We have again, using the comparison method, we've got to decide which is better out of the two white squared bishop and which is better out of the dark squared bishop and the knight. The rooks are still good for white, by the way, but the minor pieces are starting to tip back in black's favour. So rook he1, of course, king to g7, bishop to e6. I am going to criticise this move, though. My mantra at the moment, I've been banging on for a while, is even if you're materially ahead, swapping everything off isn't always the best plan. You can use that excess material for other things. And in this case, what you're doing is that bishop who's been moving to a few times is now just being swapped off for a bishop that has done nothing so far. And after this position here, suddenly black's rooks are a lot better than they were before. You kind of gave black a tempo here to get the rooks connected. So rook takes e6, rook hf8, knight d4, which was the move that should have been played instead of playing bishop e6, by the way. Rook ad8, okay, and knight f5. Now, again, this game, by the way, was played at 5 minutes, so tactics are going to be the key here, and missed tactics, this happens in Blitz all the time. I'm just going to feature rook back to e4 here with the idea that the knight is suddenly going to land on d6. E6 with forking king, rook, and rook. And the fact that it's forking 3 of these pieces makes it very difficult for black to get everything out of the road all in one go. You could try f5, but then after knight e6 here, check, king goes to f6. You just put your rook back on e2 and suddenly dropping the exchange. Knight f5 is probably the more human move, especially because after g6, white followed it up with g4. And I can see the logic behind this. There is a mating net, which is rook e7, rook g7 mate. Pure and simple. Nice mating pattern, by the way. Good one to remember, especially when you're playing just with a few minor pieces and rooks. And the king has come out. So instead, white could have just gone, having ignored my swap everything off strategy before, or white could have well done have followed that strategy now. C takes d6, king up. And the idea, of course, is that the pawn on d6 is quite weak. The 7th rank is open for one of these rooks to go into as well. So white is a lot better in this ending. And he's also a pawn up, of course. So g4, human move. But bishop takes h2, of course. So some tactics here. Oh, I've won back a pawn. So the fact that black has won back the pawn tends to cut white's choice of plans a little bit down, because previously, if you're a pawn up, you can always go for the mate. If it doesn't work, you can still go for the swap into the winning ending strategy. Now it's less likely to be swap into the winning ending strategy. For example, if you go for the mate with rook e7 now, bishop f4, king b1, rook f7 is equal, and black will hold this position, or should hold this position, depending on the time situation. Instead, white went rook h1. Okay, hitting the bishop. Bishop f4 check is fine. King b1, h6. Okay. Okay, but not quite, because I'll just show you one of the reasons why it's not quite okay. So the rook goes back here. Bishop g5 is a massive blunder because f4 traps the bishop. Rook e4. So bishop d2 is the only other real choice in this position, noting that if you play the bishop back off this diagonal, rook takes h6 is very strong, and that's why h6 was another sort of question marky type move. c3 with the idea of now playing king up to c2, rook d8, rook b4, and this ends up in a slightly different ending. Rook down to e1, for example, swap, rook takes b7, bishop takes f2, rook takes e7, rook to f7, let's swap, knight takes h6, king g6, knight f5. So after that reasonably forced line, I'm not saying it's absolutely forced, but reasonably forced line, white's still, in this case, 2 pawns up. Should win this ending, but it is going to be tricky in Blitz, because with still pawns on both sides of the board, the bishop has grown some legs, as they say, and is able probably to keep an eye on both sides. Well, the knight, less so. But anyway, rook e7 was played, okay, and rook f7 should have been the response here, okay, and then white is really struggling to convert this position into a win. Instead, rook g8 is dubious because it doesn't really challenge the rook on the 7th. So a few more moves. f3, rook down to d2 looks okay. b3, just in case white accidentally walks into a back rank mate by moving the rook off h1. Rook to h2, offering to swap. Rook to d1, not going to swap, wants the rooks on the 7th. h5 to try and sort of remove the foundation of the knight on f5 by swapping. King g5 would have been more playable here, I think, just starting to run up into the opponent's part of the position. At h5, so the rook goes here. And double rooks on the 7th are very strong. At the moment, the bishop is really well placed on f4, though, protecting c7 and a few other squares. But after h takes, f takes, I think black must have been running short of time. So remember early on, I had flagged the potential checkmate of playing the rook to g7. We now come back down to this position here, and this is the threat. The threat is now to play rook g7 here. White could try, black could try and deal with it with rook check, king b2, bishop c1, king to c3, and then king to g5. And the idea is now the black king is getting out either by taking on g4 or getting out by f4. Say rook c7, king takes g4, knight d4 here, for example. And it's slightly better for white, mainly because the black king is still a little bit out in the open, but the position isn't completely lost for black here. And white would still have to work very hard. But instead, after f takes g4, all white's dreams came true after bishop here. The logic behind this, of course, is a mate threat. Essentially, the idea is just to play rook h1, and black is mating. But black, unfortunately, fell foul of the rule that we only get to play one move in a row in chess, which means that it's now white's move, and white just went rook g7. And of course, after rook takes g7, and it's mate. So faced, basically, white had checkmate, well, faced with mate in 1 on the board, which indicates that it was a reasonably close game. But in the end, white, for want of a better word, just had most of the initiative all the way through. You know, the moment bishop c4 landed on the board, it was a lot of black dealing with white's threats. White got very rapid development, even with queens off, and was always targeting things in black's position. And black was playing defense for most of the game. White did let it slip a little bit around about this point of the game here. Rook e4 would have been a nice find because it would have been a material win. But nonetheless, this is not a bad example of how you play queenless middle games / endings, which is still about controlling key squares, getting your pieces active, And not forgetting that you can keep targeting the king, especially if there's a broken pawn structure around where the king goes. So that was the game that was played last night from the ACT Chess Association online Blitz events. My name's Sean Press. I run these on behalf of the ACT Chess Association. Wednesday night is our Rapid, which played with time limit of 10 minutes plus 2 seconds a move. And then Thursday night is our standard event, which we play with 45 minutes plus 15 seconds moves. And both of those events are actually quite popular. We normally get between 12 and 20 players for both of those events. And especially the Wednesday night, there's a nice mix of strong players and up-and-coming players. So it's good practice there. So thanks for tuning in. I'll do these summaries normally the day after the event is being held, around about 10 a.m. Canberra time. So thanks for tuning in. And until my next broadcast, I will be seeing you later.